Hello and welcome to Tartan Talk. I'm your host, Kristen Zosche, Dean of Student Life at Stuart Country Day School. And today I'm joined by none other than Tom Verni, Theology faculty member and spiritual guru here at Stuart. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Hi, Kristen. Glad to be here.
So I'm hoping that in our conversation today, we can explore the spiritual grounding of young women as a critical part of their growth, specifically as it relates to leadership formation and fostering a greater sense of purpose. You said to me the other day, our mission is fundamentally about supporting the holistic care and development of each child entrusted to us. It's about those connections and those relationships. And I thought that was just such a poignant way to summarize the work that you're doing here for all of us. So before we jump in, though, I think it's really important that you share briefly about your background as an educator, as a theologian, and as a spiritual life mentor, if you will.
I'm glad to share some of that. I've had a varied and interesting life, to say the least. I did go to church. I was part of the choir. I was part of the youth group, but really didn't live an especially religious life. I just knew I wanted something with more meaning in my life. So I decided to talk to the vocation director of the Rockville Center Diocese on Long Island, and that started a journey of about 8 years in the seminary, which all throughout that time, I taught along the way. As soon as I entered the seminary, I remember when I was 19 or 20, I was already teaching Spanish to some of my the fellow seminarians, and had a very varied experience teaching CCD and sort of religious education to grade school children, first grade, sixth grade. I was sent to Italy as part of my formation. I worked in a community with persons with developmental challenges, both physical as well as mental. I then decided to take a break from that and began teaching in an all-girls faith-based Catholic school in the greater Philadelphia area, where I taught for 22 years before coming to Stuart. And during that time, I've taught Spanish, Italian, Latin, religious studies, and philosophy, also at a small college across the street from where the high school was. And I was also the campus ministry coordinator there for a period of time.
Studies show that although young people today often don't consider themselves particularly religious in the ways that perhaps previous generations would have defined what it means to be religious, many do, in fact, take on the identity of being spiritual. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how you see this playing out for young people today, and what do they gain from this connection to a spiritual self?
Well, I think it's really the approach when we're approaching particularly teenagers who are at a point in their lives when they're defining themselves and really deciding what their value system is going to be. And in many ways, they're kind of creating a separation between themselves and their parents and who they're going to be. They very rarely respond to dogmatic sort of, this is how it is, and I want you to agree with me and repeat what I'm saying approaches. For the most part, when you tap into the spiritual, you're tapping into the sort of free will piece of connecting with youth. In other words, it's not you're doing this because I say it's the right thing to do, but I'm starting a conversation with you so that you can look at yourself introspectively and sort of just tap into this part of who we are that we rarely focus on in modern life, because I think at no greater time in history have young people kind of been distracted. They're always plugged in. They really don't spend a lot of time in a quiet place reflecting. They're extremely busy. They have a lot of demands on them academically and in extracurricular ways and in all ways, really. So to kind of just start a conversation about the spiritual part of who we are.
And, we've been doing so much work here at Stuart with our core Cordis philosophy, just thinking about what a holistic approach to education looks like, right? Recognizing that perhaps a sense of spirituality should come first before we can think about, right, our social emotional well-being and then our physical well-being and our intellectual well-being, right? That all of these facets of life are part of it. So how do we help young people just in their lives recognize this about themselves when society perhaps undervalues that spiritual dimension of life, or that mind, body, spirit connection, especially for young people?
It has to be from a place of love and of freedom and of respect. The beauty of being in a faith-based school is that we can be explicitly spiritual and reference the spiritual dimension of who we are. That's a very Sacred Heart. As we had said, the holistic approach, looking at the student and the young person in front of you, not only under the prism of their academic performance, but rather as a unique gift. Where we're at right now culturally, a lot of these sort of spiritual practices of well-being, centering and mindfulness, are trickling down into mental health in a way that's just speaking to who you are, essentially, not just the shall we say, specifically religious part of you. So I think we're in a place now where people are starting to appreciate, yes, in Western culture, we're very good in terms of our medical knowledge, we're very good in terms of our psychological practices, but maybe we haven't given enough time to the spiritual piece of our humanity, and maybe that's why we're having a hard time navigating all the stresses that we're dealing with. So by potentially giving our students the tools with which they can navigate those stresses, I think we're setting them up for greater success in life. And also coping and dealing with things like human suffering and loss and grief and disappointment. In my college classes, I often had students who had no particular religious affiliation or interest in Catholicism per se, but I would say to them, well, at some point, though, you're going to have to speak to someone and offer consolation to them if they're grieving a loss. I had students who were vet tech students, and I would say, well, to many people, that animal might have been their best friend, their beloved pet, and if they lose that pet, you're going to be navigating a language of bereavement, which is very much a spiritual language. So it's being able to convert this type of sort of learning into a very practical part of who they are, and then sort of letting them see how it can help them. And even in our class, the students love when we do mindfulness practices, and I just give them a chance to experience the benefits of just kind of like being without doing, because I think that's, as several philosophers have said, our problem in modern life is that we're human doings, we're not human beings. We don't know how to just exist, and that's really what mindfulness is. It's just being present to your physicality in one place and not allowing your mind to kind of be divided into multiple places, and you're not really present or living fully, and as I like to say, fully engaged in the use of all five of your senses. So in a Christian anthropology and understanding, and in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we are essentially all infused with this presence, which we call the ruach, which is a Hebrew word which means spirit. It's just an intrinsic part of all of us. So not everyone would recognize it or give it much weight, but the faith-based belief is that all of us have that dimension, and it's called different things in different faith traditions. Some might just call it your consciousness. Others would call it spirit. Others would call it soul. So I think it's just really just in a very materialistic world where everything is rooted in the physical, just, again, allowing them to see and navigate a world where there is a spirit that's inside of them that's, I think, is a source of great comfort. And then remembering, too, they're teenagers. So a lot of times the seeds that we plant may not come to fruition right now, right? It may come to fruition when they're 30 or 40, or when they look back and say, oh, I remember that conversation we had, and that I can see now how that applies to my life. Because I think that's the other thing, is to realize, teenagers are in process, and it is unfair to measure where they're at according to an adult standard. I think we really need to be incredibly compassionate and understanding about what they're navigating in the world today, and just try to come from a place of patience and love as we accompany them on this particular segment of their journey, which is still at a very young point in their lives.
It resonates so much what you're talking about in terms of these skills for navigating really difficult life experiences. What are some of the tools and strategies that we're practicing with young people that that don't have to just happen here, right? That the idea is that we are delivering these tools and strategies that they can bring into their everyday lives and experiences?
Well, a big part of it is just like, of course, there's the very cliched phrase, let go and let God, that we cannot control all aspects of our life. We can control our reaction, but not necessarily other people's actions. But in terms of unlocking the beauty of mindfulness, it's really, and a lot of this admittedly comes from Eastern spirituality, Buddhism and Hinduism. I recently attended a teacher's workshop, Teachers as Scholars at Princeton University, about some of the mindfulness exercises that we can engage in, even from a non-religious perspective, because it promotes so much well-being. And really, it's about being present, having the mind and the body be in the same place at the same time. If I could put in a nutshell what the root of most anxiety is, it's living in yesterday, living in an hour ago, living in an hour from now, or living in tomorrow, or a month, or a year from now. And the only thing we can truly control, and the source of all true happiness, is only found in the very moment you are in, because that's the only thing you can truly control. And if you can just learn that, to be fully present to the place and to the person you're currently with, it so greatly enriches your quality of life, because all of those other things, which are really thoughts, a thought, and this is a very Eastern concept, you don't necessarily have to engage in it. You can watch it float by, right, like a cloud, but you don't have to grab it and pull it in. So watching your thoughts, and most importantly, just being, again, present in the moment. And I like to tell the kids, discover the sacred in everyday life. So brushing your teeth, drinking a cup of coffee, going to Starbucks with a friend, those can be sacred acts if you're present to them. So don't just look for fulfillment and joy and happiness in these big culminating moments. Well, when I go on vacation in 3 months, it's going to be so wonderful. Well, no, those are exceptions. Happiness, you want it to be the rule, and that means every day I have to find joy. So when we journal, we'll say, well, what is something small that happened since I woke up this morning that I can be joyful for? Our day is peppered with all these moments of happiness and joy. But unfortunately, something in the Western mindset is always seeking the bigger and the better, and it's not just finding it in our everyday quotidian reality, which is where essentially I think happiness is. And again, it's being lived in the day and in the moment you're in. I can't stress enough how important that is. And that really is what mindfulness is, and it's anchoring the mind, which in itself is a sort of seen as a spiritual force, and it's anchoring it in the body and rooting it in the body. And that's what grounding is, right? That's what centering is. Keep your head and your feet in the same place. It sounds simple, but it's, I think, the thing we forget the most in terms of like our spiritual well-being.
Tom, I think I need to take that answer as a soundbite and play it for myself every morning as my own mindfulness practice.
And I tell the kids, the gratitude comes from the minute our 2 feet hit the floor in the morning. I said, confront each day like it's its own mini lifetime, right? And just fill it in, make it full. Have it be an enriching and fulfilling experience, because the day is what you have control over, right? And if you live that way, I think it just greatly enhances your quality of life, because again, we don't generally look at it that way. And we look at time almost as cyclical, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But in the meantime, it really isn't a cycle, right? Each day is completely new, and you're moving forward. So just learning how to like see time in that way. And another thing I talk about is when we meditate, we want to make a transition from the chronos, which is human time, to the kairos, of course, Greek, God's time. How do we make this a sacred moment for us? A lot of that is, if you're not able to do a mindfulness practice in school, for example, do it at home before you leave the house. It really only takes 5, maybe 10 minutes, and I'll call it the meditational power nap. You can re-energize. If you're having a panic attack or an anxiety, you're overwhelmed by anxiety over something, there are certain things you could do. But first of all, root yourself in your body, control your breathing. Obviously, we know the counting and the various techniques of kind of using your breath, because breath and oxygen is probably one of the resources we make the least use of in in our lives. We're horribly under-oxygenated. We're not breathing in deeply enough. So actually just using your full lung capacity, which most of us don't do, already causes a sense of well-being and calm to sort of saturate your body, because most of the time we're actually breathing in a very shallow way. And because, again, it's not even that we're doing it wrong for any reason. It's just never brought to our attention. I think a great deal of this entire conversation about even just spiritual growth is about just bringing attention to something, and then it kind of takes its course, because I do think the spiritual it's intrinsic to us, and it kind of like, it's natural. It's there, and we just kind of conform to it in the way that we're meant to once we know about it. And again, that's a big approach in my pedagogy, is putting these subjects on the table, these spiritual topics, having students engage in them. And even if they're not at a place in their own development and their own discernment where it's meaningful, at least it's in their mind, they're aware of it, to make use of it when they're ready.
And this is the core of why we are drastically rethinking student well-being and how we approach education. Because like you said, right, we are grounding the skills and practice of breath work in a spiritual development. Yet, as you mentioned, when we really are able to take advantage of that breath work, the impact it almost immediately has on our central nervous system is incredible. And so that, right, that spiritual grounding, and now we're talking about that emotional and psychological well-being rooted in physical health, and all of these things, right? That understanding of self, to go back to what you said at the beginning, it's about a journey of self-discovery. That understanding of self is where we ground ourselves in a power to lead and be successful, however we define that, right?
But if absolutely, and also trying to impart the value of finding the ability to re-energize possibly in a place of solitude. You know, we talk about what's the difference between being alone and being lonely, and being able to take yourself off the social media grid for a while. It's like a slow drain on their battery, particularly since the social media has become omnipresent and on our cell phones, that it's really eroded many skill sets in our teenagers, because so much energy is being diluted in that direction, and they're not able to focus on other parts of their growth. And in prior times, in just virtue of how society was structured, you were just unplugged more. And that silence allowed you to come to many of these spiritual conclusions just through your own introspection and through relationships and through connections. Today, they don't have that, so we have to make that time for them.
That connection piece, I think that connection piece is so important. I was at a conference the other day, and one of the keynotes said, "It's wild that social media convinced us that 15 likes isn't enough. Imagine 15 people in real life telling you that you look good." And I think that's so fascinating, right? And you talk about this in your work too, the idea of human connection and what happens when we don't have it, right? And I think that really stood out to me in the ways that we think about how teenagers are moving through the world and how they're experiencing life, and how social media has impacted their understanding of themselves and what connection and relationships are. And it sounds like you see your work as helping to counter that.
And you really think about it, it's been maybe 25 years since the internet has really become so much a big factor of our lives. Social media, maybe 10, 12, 15 years. And humanity has a much longer history of that. So we're asking, there's been so much cultural and technological development in a very short period of time, and it's kind of like blinded us in some ways to the other resources that are at our disposal. So I think that's really unfortunate, but I think it's on people's radars now, and I think that's why most schools now have policies regarding cell phones, because when we actually have to relate to one another and connect to one another, a whole different sphere of us develops. And I think kind of like it happened so quickly, people were like, they just didn't pay much attention to it. But now, when young people are together, maybe they'll play a board game, or they'll actually have a conversation digging into some deeper issues, and they don't feel as isolated. and then they're able to connect. And I do have to stress that even from our Sacred Heart perspective, that Sacred Heart spirituality is intrinsically relational. It's intrinsically community-based, and that itself, community and the relationship, is spiritual. And that's opening up that part of you to grow in a world where most of us live very balkanized and we don't have the deeper human conversations, because what's so important is that humanity and spirituality are inextricably linked. One is the gateway to the other. It doesn't act in contraposition to it. It's not a denial of it, but it's an enhancement of it. So really, once you tap into the spiritual, you're just freeing the inner person to reach the potential that they're supposed to. And what's really important to me also, and I've spoke about this before, is that we avoid dehumanization or othering of those who have a different perspective than we do. We're all raised in different environments, under different cultural influences, and an interesting point we discussed at my most recent workshop at Princeton regarding religious diversity in the secondary classroom is that we also, as long as we can identify that the person with whom we're dealing has goodwill, if there is goodwill, even if we disagree, we have a point of departure. And very few people who hold to certain positions do that because they are intrinsically evil and want the bad. Somehow they've come to conclude that this is the right way. Now, I might still disagree with them, but at least I can see the shared, because I have goodwill too, or the common good in mind, as do you. We disagree in how we approach it, but I don't see you reflexively as evil or bad. I just see you as different. But that has to be established first. And I think that's another means of approaching civil dialogue, given the ethos of where we're at right now in culture.
I think everything you're talking about, as we know, are the healthy ways to reframe the way that we approach conflict and difficulty. And it is in that spiritual grounding. And so I just think there's so much value as we proactively give our students those skills and strategies so that they don't end up in a situation that I think so many adults are in now, trying to figure out, what can I do to help ABC thing that I'm experiencing? And I think it's why we're seeing that boom in terms of yoga, mindfulness, right? It's all over social media.
There's a hunger for it, and it's unfortunate because, again, Western society generally never really gave a lot of value to that. Other cultures, it could have been the Taoist and Confucianist aspect or the Buddhist aspect. There was always this substrate of sort of a spiritual meditational piece that was within the culture, even not just from a religious perspective, because that's another conversation, but in many ways, what we call philosophy and theology and how we divide them and culture is very much a Western paradigm. And that in many of these cultures, in Eastern society, these were just things that were taken for granted as just part of good living, without having to say religion. But we created a dichotomy in Western culture between religion and like daily life that was so intrinsic to us. First of all, in our, it was Hobbes, it was the Second Treatise, it was separation of church and state, and these two things should really be very separate. But to such a degree that not only the religious but also the spiritual is totally eschewed and cast aside. And at the end of the day, now we've totally neglected a part of our well-being that is foundational to our happiness. So more and more Western society, thankfully, is going backwards a little bit, which could also mean going forwards and saying, well, wait a minute. And that's why even in things like certain homeopathic remedies or acupuncture or other things are now being given great weight in Western medicine, because they're saying, well, wait a minute. Yes, the West does interventional medicine very well. We're great to responding to crises, but how can we actually not just do this sort of reactionary approach, but how can we do one which puts into place a lifestyle which doesn't get us to that point where we're at? Because we are amongst despite the wealth of and all that we have in the United States, we are not the healthiest of people in many ways. So what are we doing wrong? Why do other cultures that may not have a certain level of pharmaceutical or medicinal access, statistically much healthier, and in some cases have higher life expectancies than we do. And I think it's because we've chosen to ignore totally the spirit, the ruach.
And one final question or pondering. You said something that really stood out to me the other day. And I think you said it specifically as it relates to the teaching of theology, but I do think it can expand to all teaching and, quite frankly, in all relationships. You said we teach theology more by how we act than by what we say. And I love that so much. So can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. I think that the primary source of sort of conveying to the student whatever the messaging is in your lesson is kindness and love. And of course, Maya Angelou's very famous quote, years down the road, a student may not remember what you said, but they will remember how you made them feel, that you celebrated them, that you cared for them, that you honored them. I think that's essential. And another famous quote I like to use is attributed to St. Francis, preach the gospel and if necessary, speak. So it really is through kindness and love and patience and care and nurturance that the student comes to know the messaging that you're trying to communicate. It isn't through theological sort of platitudes. It's really just through your day-to-day interactions. And it shouldn't be, I as teacher am going to put upon a student my subjective, whatever. It's no, evaluate your student and what their needs are and try to convey in a language that they will understand and in an approach that they will, that can reach them, the message of whatever it is that you're teaching. And in my case, since it is theology and hopefully a gateway into the spiritual life, it's through my behavior. And we don't forget the people who were kind and loving and caring and patient with us. And I think that's just an extremely important way of making that connection. And like I said, and from a Christian perspective, we say, the love that is conveyed through the members of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? It's community, it's relationship, and that trickles down obviously into our Sacred Heart piece. And it just trickles down to who we are as human beings, right? We all seek community, and the other beauty of religion, and this is shared, the isomorphisms of all the major world religions, is self-transcendence, right? Getting to that point where we learn it's not just about us and our own self-fulfillment, but that ultimately, as we become adults, it's about transitioning to other, both other lowercase as well as other uppercase, and realizing now that my greatest fulfillment is going to come from giving of myself to other people, contributing to in a spirit of solidarity to the enhancement of the human condition through my life. That it all really has to start with the spiritual, because we have to replenish. If we're going to give to others, a little Latin phrase, nemo dat quod non habet, no one can give what they don't have. We have to replenish, and that's where the meditation piece comes in. We feed our bodies, hopefully, with very healthy food. We exercise. The other little, you could tell I'm a Latin teacher, another Latin phrase, mens sana in corpore sano, healthy mind and a healthy body. But I like to throw in also a healthy soul, or a spiritually refreshed soul. So we have to refresh ourselves. And regardless of your spiritual tradition, Christians can call it the Holy Spirit, you might call it divine energy, whatever you might call it. We need to replenish spiritually so that we have the ability to give to others, really in a way that's nonstop in most of our lives. You can't do that if you haven't taken time to do that. So I think it's so important. A little light goes off when you start practicing meditation, and you start saying, oh, I was missing out on all of this. I like to say even conceptualize light. If you really are in a place of exhaustion emotionally or whatever, just close your eyes for 5 or 10 minutes and I like to visualize it as God's love and light, or just spiritual energy, and allow yourself to bask in that and open yourself up to it. And replenish yourself, much as you would replenish yourself if you were thirsty, the physical body, or you sleep to rest, right? You have to replenish. And then you go into your day with such a different perspective. But we neglect it. We go through life on autopilot. let's not go through a life on autopilot. Let's go through life as, again, every moment, every encounter is meaningful. Every daily task that we engage in, be present to it and elevate it almost to a sacred moment. And you're already feeding your soul just through your everyday experiences and activities. One last thing. What I try to teach is optimism versus pessimism. So flipping that little switch by practicing gratitude, because if you look at the glass as half full, it very much changes your vision versus coming from a place of deprivation and what I don't have. The blessing, I tell them, of our friends and our family and where we go to school and our environment. I mean, we are so blessed, and focusing on that, because if you come at these conversations from a place of inner richness, you're predisposed to be giving, because we possess so much, and then we give. But if you're coming at a lot of these conversations from a place of deprivation and what I don't have, well then, you're in the hoarding phase. It's all about me. So I think very, very important to this is also the practice of gratitude. And every day, they have gratitude journals, and also what I call affirmations and what they call gift sessions. So if you see or acknowledge something in a friend that you never told them about, but that you thought was a gift they have or a special trait they have, let them know what it is. I remember kind things said to me by friends when I was like a very small child, and I haven't forgotten them. Because we live in a society with so much negativity that your one kind phrase or authentic compliment, like not something you're making up, can actually be life-changing in that moment. So to try to infuse and imbue your life with those positive, affirming things that you could say to each other as, students or just people in general, is extremely important in a world of negativity. So again, just reflexively seeing the good in other and not reflexively seeing their faults, which is another pervasive negative trait of modern society. If even a small part of what I share with them comes through, and they're allowed to access any of these things we discuss as a source of comfort, whether it be mindfulness, whether it be breathing, whether it be just knowing that a loving God is always here for you, I've done my job.
Tom, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I feel so enlightened by what you've shared. I think I've learned so much personally from this, just in the ways to think about how important this work is for young people and helping them to live their most fulfilled lives, and how at the core of it is about relationships and how we show up for ourselves so that we can show up for others. So I am in gratitude to you. Thank you for everything that you do here, and just for the amazing insight that you've shared with all of us today.
Thank you so much. This was very enjoyable. I look forward to other conversations, and this was just a real blessing. I appreciate it.